FDA software approval. Many of you are interested in how do I get FDA software? Well, we should really call it clearance. FDA doesn't generally approve software. Approvals are for PMAs. But what about FDA's new off-the-shelf software guidance? The thumbnail of this YouTube video is the old store Babbage's that was around in the 1980s, where you really could walk into a store and buy software in a cardboard box off the shelf, even though all that was inside of it was a floppy disk. We still call it off-the-shelf or OTS software. Sometimes it's called COTS, commercial off-the-shelf software. And it does open up a large can of worms. Before we talk in detail about off-the-shelf software and how it's regulated for pre-market submissions with FDA, let's talk again just about how things get developed for FDA. This diagram, I left the figure 1 header on it because I don't think many people know this. I went back to the original source of this diagram, which is now proliferated all across the internet. Everybody uses this. I mean, we use this at Into Being. We'll show it to people. Where does it come from? It does come from an FDA document on design controls. Most people don't include the figure number. Application of design controls to waterfall design process. FDA borrowed it from Health Canada. I just think you need to know that because I think it's entertaining. But this is, in a nutshell, the design control process. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about software, doesn't matter whether we're talking about hardware. You start with the needs of the user and the patient. These need to be reduced into design inputs. You're usually considering technical requirements, standards, risk analysis, and more in that process. From there, you can actually get into the design process, designing the device that you want to put on the market. The design output is the actual outputs, the schematics, the drawings, the diagrams, the bills of materials, the assembly diagrams that are used to put the device together. And from that, a finished medical device can be made. But let me use the word loose ends for just a minute here. There could be a million loose ends developed as a part of that process. And if you've ever been part of development, you know it's easy to get loose ends, things that don't line up. This waterfall and the 2 loop backs that occur in it, verification and validation, as well as the design reviews that are scattered throughout the process, are intended to remove loose ends. This is just as true about hardware as it is about software. If we understand this very, very basic principle, that the design and development process through the design control process, especially as specified in 21 CFR 820.30, is intended to show that there aren't any loose ends, or certainly not any loose ends that are worth considering any further. That and the final approval of the device, not by the FDA, but by the company putting it on the market, that final report that says this is ready to go, is really an analysis of whether there are loose ends that still need cleaning up. We had all our inputs. We made all our outputs. We were able to test them. We were able to demonstrate that everything that mattered was accomplished within that loop. Okay, so now you understand about loose ends. Well, let's go back to that latest FDA guidance on off-the-shelf software. If we just look at nothing more than the index, we'll see that there are documentation elements that FDA requires. There's nothing really surprising about these. There's description of off-the-shelf software. There's a risk assessment. Guess where that goes? That goes throughout the life cycle, but it starts in the design inputs. There's software testing as a part of verification and validation. They tell us right where that goes in the process. Now, this is something that maybe we're not as familiar with, the assurance of development methodologies and continued maintenance of the off-the-shelf software. This is one of those places where loose ends are going to crop up, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. This is really a search for loose ends that are unique to off-the-shelf software. Loose ends may be controllable. They may be boundable. And if they're not, it's going to create problems, just as though we never finished our design and development process. So even if you can take a piece of off-the-shelf software and stick it into your device, if you can't prove that the loose ends are controlled for, you may not want to use that within your device. We'll talk also about master files for devices, off-the-shelf software changes requiring a 510K. Today we're going to skip over investigational device exemption and changes, PMAs, and most of the product labeling stuff. But I want to get you a flavor for this. If you're interested in off-the-shelf software for investigational device exemptions for clinical trials, this would be a great document to come to. If you're interested in doing a PMA and using off-the-shelf software in it, this would be a great document to come to. The link is in the YouTube description, as it always is. FDA notes that the use of general-purpose computer hardware and software, as it becomes more prevalent, OTS is just really attractive to use. But if it's intended for general-purpose computing, you may not want to use it in a medical device. How would you know? Here's the key. If you use it, you're giving up software lifecycle control. That waterfall chart that we just showed, you don't actually own that with respect to the off-the-shelf software. Nor can you trust that a commercial off-the-shelf software vendor intended it for use in a medical device and is doing the things that are part of that waterfall. So now you're running sort of blind. All you can do is look for loose ends and bound them and risk manage them. That's really what this document is all about. And there are specifics in here that we'll go through. Again, it is a guidance, not legally enforceable like all FDA guidances, but FDA does hew pretty closely to their guidances when they can. So, OTS is something where the manufacturer cannot claim complete software lifecycle control. And this guidance applies to 510Ks, de novos, pre-market approvals, investigational device exemptions, or humanitarian device exemptions. Like FDA's new guidance on the content of pre-market submissions for medical device software, which we've covered in a previous episode, this documentation level now comes down to the idea of basic or enhanced. They're sort of moving away from the three-level process towards just basic or enhanced documentation. And there's not a lot of difference between the two for off-the-shelf software. You got to do everything for all of them with the exception of this assurance of development methodologies and continued maintenance of OTS software. So if you can say you're only requiring a basic documentation level, congratulations, you will be able to omit that last part. If you don't fit under the basic documentation level, you're probably going to have to do that. But let's talk about what's involved in some of these. So a description of the off-the-shelf software. FDA wants to know, in your pre-market submission, the title and manufacturer of the OTS software. That makes sense. How about the version level, the release date, the patch number, the upgrade designation, as appropriate? What software documentation will be provided to the end user? And why is it appropriate for this medical device? We've had applications before where the software exists and it's used for the purpose that we're interested in, even if it's not originally a medical purpose. So why wouldn't you reuse it? FDA is opening that door. They're making that possible. But what are the expected design limitations of the OTS software if it wasn't designed for this medical purpose? Are you getting yourself painted into a corner? In your design history file, where you're doing your design documentation, you do need to document what version, among other things, you're using, and you need to keep that updated. What about the computer system specifications for off-the-shelf software? Can it just run on anything? No, remember, this is putting boundaries around loose ends. The more boundaries we can put around loose ends, the more likely FDA is going to be okay with the choice of us using off-the-shelf software. The hardware specifications, the software specifications, you want to document those. Don't just assume that, yeah, get this software, install it on something, and run it. Document all of those elements. How are you going to control the end user enough to make sure that they get the right results out of the software? Because you're not designing it. You're not even writing the training materials for it. You're just letting them use it like it is. Make sure they know what has to be installed or configured. What steps are permitted or have to be taken during the installation? How often will the configuration need to be changed? Education, training. And if there's parts of the software you don't want them using, how are you stopping them from using it? What if the OTS software gives them control that they shouldn't have? Can you really mitigate that? And if you can, make sure that you do and that you describe how it is mitigated. Functions. Function has become a big focus for basic versus enhanced documentation. What are the functions of it? What's it intended to do? Even if it didn't have an intended use like a medical device, you need to talk about it in those terms. How does it talk to other software outside of the medical device? You need to talk about verification and validation. It'd be nice to have a list of results of the testing, in fact, required. Is there a current list of off-the-shelf software problems or bugs to access and access to updates? Now, updates are a two-edged sword because if there are problems and the manufacturer of the software is updating them and you can take semi-control of that and you can roll that out to your users, well, that's a great assurance. But the flip side of that is, what if the software vendor makes changes and rolls them out and the software changes underneath the hood of your medical device? That's not so good. The potential for that is a loose end that you would want to control for. Where will you store the software? How will you ensure this is it? You're going to have to read through the document if you're doing OTS software, or happy to talk to you. But here's the thing. Where are the loose ends? Where could somebody go wrong? Don't take for granted that you just grab your laptop and install it and everything's going to be okay. Those loose ends have to be discovered, described, and mitigated. There's more in here about software testing. And then this assurance of development methodologies and continued maintenance of the software. This is the place where I think you'll want to pause if you do need enhanced documentation for your OTS and really, really understand Section D. We won't cover it in great depth right now, but this is a place where you need to convince yourself and convince FDA that the development and qualification documentation, you can assure it. There's some way to assure it. And it's hard because you don't own the company necessarily that's making the off-the-shelf software. Mechanisms for assuring the continued performance, maintenance, and support of the OTS software. I think there's two ways to go on this. Back in the days when a lot of programs were just one executable file that was never going to change, and once it was there, it was sort of there for good, and you get a version number and you're good to go. I mean, that's nice to be able to say, but so many times today, software is updated. You know, your phones, many of the apps are updated every 2 weeks. Well, if you're going to go with a software vendor off the shelf that does make changes, that might be good. They might be fixing bugs. But how do those software changes impact you? At some level, you're going to need some understanding or agreement with that company so that you can tell FDA, this is how it's going to change. This is not unlike the purchasing controls required as a part of 21 CFR 820. Where FDA suggests, it's not technically a requirement, that part of your purchasing agreements for hardware with your vendors actually cover the scenario where the product changes. And where possible, you should make it a part of your contract that the hardware vendor will let you know in advance when a product is changing so you can see what the impact is on your device. There's an echo of this in the software development methodologies and continued maintenance of off-the-shelf software. Now, there are some interesting opportunities. Master files for devices. I think this may be an unexplored place. I'm going to be talking in an upcoming week with a sterilization vendor with novel sterilization methods. You don't sterilize software, but one thing in common between sterilization methods, materials, and software is you can have master files. You can have a master file on record with the FDA. This is when a vendor says, we want to make it possible for people to use our material, our sterilization method, our software functions. So we're going to do a lot of that legwork for you. We're going to give it to FDA. We're not giving you the product. We're giving you the master file so that FDA, you can trust that a lot of that verification and validation and documentation is already done within that master file. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm using Gene's software. Hey, I'm using Gene's material. Hey, I'm using Gene's sterilization method. Go reference that master file. It's already on record with the FDA. Makes life that much easier. I think this is an unexplored area for software that really could come of age. Changes to off-the-shelf software requiring a new 510K. It's a very short paragraph. This is really no different than how we do it with other changes to medical devices. Deciding when to submit a 510K for a change to an existing device. That's the flowchart that we all know and love. We won't talk today about investigational device exemptions and changes there or pre-market approval. But labeling, one of the big things that's talked about there is simply that the user manual for your product specify the versions of the off-the-shelf software that can be used with the medical device. But note this, you wouldn't really need that for embedded software where the user does not select the software and cannot change the software. So if you're using OTS software embedded within your product, it's probably going to save you a lot of headaches versus saying, go to this website, download this software, install it, and then hope for the best. This is going to give you a lot more control if you can take some of the control away from the user and require less labeling on your part. So it's a brave new world with off-the-shelf software, maintenance and obsolescence considerations, safety, design. Software testing is a part of V&V. Installation, obsolescence, product configuration, considerations of operating systems, drivers, utilities. It's not that you wouldn't have to consider these things if you're developing your own software. It's just that FDA knows enough to say local area networks, LANs and other networks, to say if you're using off-the-shelf software, you better close up all these loopholes, close up all of these dangling threads so that you can really give us a risk analysis on this. There's examples in this document. You can read them if you're interested, but it's a really interesting document, and it's really cool to see FDA dealing with the question of software. So off-the-shelf software, the door is open. Is it a shoo-in? Should you always use off-the-shelf software and then go and submit it to FDA as a part of your device clearance? Not necessarily. It really is a question of, can you close off the loose ends, the dangling threads that are out there? That's really no different than the basic device development process that we follow at Intube, being the design control process or any other good device development firm, whether it's a startup or a third-party vendor. But that also applies to off-the-shelf software, but you don't control the design. So you have to bound it. You got to put that fence up around it and show that nothing is going to slip out of any major consequence. If you liked what you heard today, please like and subscribe to the video and to the channel. As always, free learning from MedTech Crossroads is going to save you headaches in your medical device development journey. Thank you for being with us.